Waver Velvet is an orphan boy and a third-rate mage from the Clock Tower, a prestigious school for young mages in London. He always thought he was a genius, but his professor, Lord Kenneth Elmeloy, dismissed his stupidity and ripped his theories up. Determined to prove him wrong, he stole Lord Kenneth's Relic, an artifact that can summon a great hero of the past to participate in the Fourth Holy Grail War. However, during the fight, he got completely destroyed, losing his servant Iskandar and his professor. Months after the war ended, Waver decided to travel around the world to find clues on how to summon his former servant Iskandar again, to participate in the next war in 10 years. During his travels, he gets captured, getting reunited with his friend, Melvin Wines, who was the rich kid in his class. They manage to escape, and on their way back, Waver asks Melvin for a small loan of millions of dollars to buy the rights of getting back to the Clock Tower and his professor's research. He wants to revive his professor's special classes because he feels guilty about being the reason his teacher summoned a weak hero and passed away during the war. 3 years later, Waver has been abducted and forced to agree to a contract by Rhianese, his professor's niece. She questions Waver how the hell did he not die during the war but his uncle did. Waver tells Rhianese how he survived the war and his progress until he became a famous teacher in the Clock Tower. Rhianese ends up revealing that she's the successor to the late professor, and since Kenneth is not alive, she's going to replace him as one of the lords in the Clock Tower. But there's one problem: she's too young to lead. So, she asks Waver to keep the seat warm until she's old enough to do it herself, while at the same time getting enough money to pay her faction's debt. Because her family went bankrupt after Waver stole his professor's relic. Due to him being partially responsible for Kenneth's inevitable death, Waver accepts the offer and requests to add the second in his new name in honor of the late Lord Kenneth. And so Waver becomes Lord Elmeloy II, taking the mantle of his previous mentor. A few years later, Waver has been teaching as a professor in the Clock Tower, but since that's not enough to pay Elmeloy's family debt, he also needs to do some other side jobs as a mage. As a practitioner and lecturer of the modern magecraft theories created by the former Elmeloy, he excels in the arts of modern magic and investigates cases related to it. This is to further his understanding and excel in his own field. One morning, Rhianese asks him to investigate Ernest Fargo's death, who suddenly died for unknown reasons. So Waver takes on the job, along with his trusted assistant and apprentice, Gray, whom he hates her face because she looks like Saber. The group arrives at the Fargo mansion and enters, meeting Mary, his former student, and the other two family members, Fernando and Alec. Waver examines the house and finds out that the entire house was made specifically to be his workshop for an experiment. Mary explains that his dad was trying to reach eternity, but failed in doing so. While investigating, the maid alerts them that Alec has been killed. After investigating Alec's body, Waver concludes that the house itself is the perpetrator. This activates the magic symbols and Ernest pops out, asking for Mary's life, because he needs to kill people to reach his immortality, but Waver asks Gray to eliminate him. Gray activates her cage, releasing her scythe weapon. Ernest attacks her, but the scythe absorbs the magic. Gray goes after Ernest while she chants her ability. Once she gets an opening, she goes after the spirit and destroys it, absorbing all the malevolent mana in the house. A couple of days later, Waver gets informed that his favorite tea house had been closed down due to some electrical malfunction. The owners tell them that they sent an extermination team, but one of the exterminators didn't return, and the guy who did became traumatized by what he saw. Waver asks permission to check things out and heads down the sewers. He finds out that the entire sewer has been turned into a testing ground by a mage. However, a beast attacks him from behind, knocking him out. Sometime later, his students find him unconscious. Waver tells them that the beast was made by a mage and it feeds itself on electricity. Flat orders Esvin to take Waver to the hospital while he and Gray will deal with the mage behind the electrical monster. Things are getting rough for Gray and Flat, but Waver arrives to save them. Waver recognizes the mage, who's named Sir Goldova Davenant, another prominent mage in their ranks. He tells Davenant that he's being arrested for his crimes against humanity, especially for bringing an electrical monster to the world. However, while enjoying his tea time, Waver gets another case handed down to him by Rhianese. Waver and the gang meets with Wills, who's also a lecturer in the tower. His father, Sir Trevor Pelham Codrington, was a grand necromancer, but has recently died from getting hit by lightning. Wills asks for Waver's expertise regarding spiritual evocation and to solve the mystery surrounding his father's death. A few years ago, Trevor Codrington created the Marbury Workshop, But the workshop ran out of control, which caused the lightning strikes to randomly kill civilians who happened to pass by its range. According to Waver, the ley line was severed, which caused the malfunctions in the workshop, but he needs to investigate further. Upon arriving at the mansion, Wills gets entangled by a white snake, who transforms into a bind. Ms. Adeshino, a colleague of Waver, appears and introduces Waver to Willetta Codrington, who's going to own the land if Wills can't do something about the lightning strikes as well as his father's death. Willetta quickly points out that Wills is the reason for the lightning strikes as well as the fact that he tried to call on his father, but Waver dismisses her reasoning. But Waver decides it needs a proper investigation. After some time, Waver learns that Wills can see fairies through his eyes, and every time the fairy appears, someone dies. Later, a Japanese freelancer mage, Kairi Shishigu, appears in the house, providing them with new information. Upon hearing it, Waver heads out of their room to check something out. Later that night, Gray wakes him up and informs him that Willetta got hit by lightning. Wills tries to call Willetta's soul, and Adeshino points out that Wills gains the most from her death, but Waver dismisses her claims. Adeshino complies and decides to imprison Wills for the time being. Later, Shishigu informs Waver that they've been attacked by a black dog, another lightning beast. He then adds that Gray's code was feared by the dog and inquires about the weapon. Wills tells him that Gray's weapon is actually King Arthur's weapon. Wavers goes on to talk about Gray's origin, and Shishigu adds that King Arthur is the king of ghosts and fairies. Waver checks everything and starts performing a ritual using Riene's mystic eyes in conjunction with Will's fairy eyes. By performing the ritual, they're able to communicate with the fairy, who tells them that she killed Trevor. Waver reveals that the workshop is a giant murder machine, designed by Trevor to kill people. The lightning strikes weren't random, they're premeditated murders. The fairy tells them that Trevor deceived her and used the fairy's cores to supply the workshop machines. After confirming everything, Waver casts some magic, activating the workshop and summoning a gateway, a portal to the underworld. This gateway let the dogs out in the open, attacking the mages. Gray, Shishigu, Waver, and Wills all go into action to intercept the dogs, while Adeshino defends the mansion. Although they manage to trim the numbers, there are still dogs spawning endlessly. Waver asks Gray to use her power, and Gray activates her abilities to summon her weapon, the legendary Spear of King Arthur. Once the pack leader is within a few meters of Gray, she thrusts the legendary spear, piercing the dog and the portal, creating a massive explosion. However, the portal isn't destroyed, so Will steps forward to destroy the portal and joins the fairy. In the aftermath, Adashina gives Waver some documents concerning Rail Zeppelin, a phantom train that buys and sells mystic eyes. A few days later, Waver informs Gray that his relic of Iskandar was stolen from him, and the only clue is a letter with an invitation to the Rail Zeppelin, asking her to come with him. Waver arrives at the train station with Calls, another one of his students, Gray, and Adeshino. There, they see prominent figures from the tower, who will most likely buy something from the expensive Zeppelin's auctions. Inside the train, he gets another letter, which follows up on the previous letter he received after getting his relic stolen. The daughter of Lord of Astromancy, Animasphere, appears and informs him something about the Holy Grail War. This piques his curiosity, as this is what Waver's been after for the longest time, expecting to reunite with his former hero. They talk about how there's speculation that Iskandar won't be able to remember Waver from the past war. A few moments later, Waver and Gray suddenly hear a scream and head to the location to check it out, just to find out that Trisha, the one who just talked to Waver, has been murdered. She has been beheaded and the culprit is nowhere to be found, as well as Trisha's severed head. A member of the Holy Church, usually a natural enemy of every mage in the train, examines the body. After examining, Father Karabo informs them that Trisha has been killed recently. Waver points out that she's probably targeted due to her having the mystic eyes of premonition, a powerful set of eyes that can predict the future. They try to interrogate Karabo, who's a wielder of the mystic eyes of the past, but he tells them that he can't see the past from Trisha's state. Waver can't point it out, but something doesn't add up, so he leaves Olga in Gray's care while he's investigating. He meets up with Adeshino and she gives hints about the previous cases Waver has handled before having a connection to this case. While discussing things with Gray, a lightly armored woman appears and attacks them. Gray intercepts the woman and Waver realizes that the woman is a ghost liner, a materialization of a heroic spirit, basically a fake copy of the heroes. The woman activates her eyes, turning Gray against Waver, as Gray is about to slice Waver in half, but the scythe activates its cleansing power, unbinding the woman's control over Gray. The woman then summons Gordius Wheel, Iskandar's noble phantasm, She detests Waver's affiliation with Iskandar and renounces Waver's master role over Iskandar, introducing herself as Hephaestion, Iskandar's prime confidante. As she lands a finishing blow against the two, Grey tries to attack Hephaestion, but Waver stops her from doing so, taking her electrical attack. Calls manages to save them just in time, but Waver falls unconscious. 2 days after the fight, Waver wakes up and interrupts Adeshino from falsely accusing Karabo of murdering Trisha. But Adeshino still pins Karabo for murdering Trisha, even though she lacks evidence. The Zeppelin's spirit takes Karabo's eyes and places it under their auction inventory. Waver interrogates Karabo, asking the priest about his involvement in the serial murder 7 years ago. However, Karabo reveals that he doesn't remember anything, because his mystic eyes have been controlling his body since he got them. Waver decides to buy Karabo's eyes, asking for Melvin's help once again, who happens to stumble into the train. Grey tells Waver that she saw Trisha wearing a pendant, which Waver declares is the key to solving the mystery of the murder. Waver strikes a deal with Olga and the two collaborate to ramp up the prices of the mystic eyes in the auction. As the two talk about the Holy Grail War, Waver learns that Olga's father stopped going for the Grail because he later found out that the Holy Grail itself is useless against the Greater Grail. He reveals to Olga that Trisha was investigating the matter simply to know why Olga's father stopped loving her. After piecing out the information he has, Waver attends the auction to bid for the mystic eyes. While on break, Waver asks for Melvin's help again. Once the auction resumes, Waver goes on a bidding war against Adeshina. But as he's losing it, he stops and reveals the truth about the assassinations, including Trisha's. Calls appears while bringing out Trisha's head, which Olga found yesterday. Waver explains that the serial killings 7 years ago are similar to Trisha's case, and being beheaded doesn't mean they're dead. The purpose of the beheading is to take their heads to use the mystic eyes freely without taking it off of the owner's head. Trisha's eyes open and suddenly, Calls gets bound, revealing him to be Heartless, the serial killer mage that manipulated Father Karabo to murder mages 7 years ago. Dr. Heartless commends Waver's intellect and perception, but then summons the ghost liner, Hephaestion, to battle. Hephaestion attacks Adeshino, knocking her out, and Heartless reveals that Hephaestion's class is called Faker, a residual copy of a noble hero. Heartless requests to open up Pandemonium where they'll battle against Waver and Grey, and returns the Relic of Iskandar back to Waver. As soon as Waver gets the relic, Heartless turns to retreat. But Waver tells Hephaestion that she hated Iskandar's army, and that's why she doesn't have any given name. Faker gets angry and goes after Waver. Grey becomes his shield so that Waver can talk trash about her. Faker gets past Grey and attacks Waver. Luckily, Calls made it just in time to restrict her movement. Heartless summons the Forest of Einash, but the Zeppelin crew shoots it down, together with the mages working together to destroy it. The train stops and Father Karabo is in front of Grey to kill Heartless but loses to Faker. Faker then attacks Grey, but Grey manages to injure her thanks to Waver's intervention. Faker summons the Gordius Wheel and flies to do a diving charge toward Grey. Grey chants her abilities and Father Karambo advises her to listen to the voices etched within her spear, making her unlock her full potential. As Faker delivers the Hecatic Wheel, Grey summons the Spear of King Arthur, unleashing a bright yellow ray of energy, utterly destroying Faker and Heartless once and for all. After the